The morning mist clings to the Germanic forests like the breath of ancient gods, and through this ethereal veil emerges a sight that would strike terror into the hearts of Rome's enemies. Not the glint of polished bronze shields, nor the crimson plumes of centurion helmets, but something far more primal, far more terrifying. Low to the ground, muscles rippling beneath coarse fur, eyes burning with predatory intelligence, moves a creature that embodies the very essence of Roman military might. This is no ordinary dog. This is Canis Pugnax, literally fighting dog in Latin, a four-legged weapon of war so formidable that ancient historians would describe them as lions without manes, and wolves made tame only to roam. Standing nearly 3 feet at the shoulder, weighing upwards of 150 pounds, these mastiff-like giants possessed jaws capable of crushing bone and spirits, trained for one purpose: to serve as Rome's most devastating psychological and physical weapon. But how did a dog, man's best friend, become one of history's most feared instruments of warfare? How did these canine warriors shape the destiny of empires and leave their paw prints across the blood-soaked battlefields of antiquity? Today we journey back 2,000 years to discover the untold story of Rome's secret weapon that walked on 4 legs and fought with the fury of the gods themselves. To understand the rise of the Canis Pugnax, we must first journey to the fog-shrouded islands of ancient Britain, where the story begins not with Rome, but with her enemy. In the sacred groves of the Druids, beneath oak trees older than memory itself, the Celtic tribes of Britain had already mastered the art of war dogs centuries before Roman sandals ever touched their shores. The Celts called them quen rifle, warhounds, and they were woven into the very fabric of Celtic society. These weren't mere pets or hunting companions, they were warriors in their own right, blessed by priests, fed on the finest meat and treated with the reverence typically reserved for human champions. Ancient Celtic law even specified compensation rates for war dogs killed in battle, a testament to their extraordinary value. When Julius Caesar first landed on the beaches of Kent in 55 BCE, his legionaries expected to face painted warriors wielding iron swords and wooden shields. What they encountered instead were creatures that seemed to emerge from the realm of nightmares. British war dogs standing as tall as a man's chest, charged alongside their human masters with a ferocity that shook even Rome's most battle-hardened veterans. Caesar himself, in his commentary De Bello Gallico, wrote with barely concealed admiration, "The Britons employ in war chariots drawn by swift horses, but more fearsome still are their hounds, which fight with such courage that they seem to possess the spirits of warriors fallen in previous battle." The first encounters were devastating for the Romans. These British mastiffs, ancestors of what would become the Canis Pugnax, could knock a fully armored legionary to the ground, their massive jaws clamping down on shield arms with bone-crushing force. They moved with coordinated pack tactics, targeting the gaps in Roman formations with an intelligence that suggested extensive training. But Rome had built an empire not just through military might, but through adaptation and assimilation. What Rome could not immediately conquer, she studied, learned from, and ultimately improved upon. The same strategic mind that would turn Germanic longboats into Roman naval vessels, and Celtic cavalry tactics into auxiliary units now turned its attention to these 4-legged weapons of war. By 50 BCE, the first captured British war dogs were being transported across the Channel in specially constructed ships, their massive forms secured in bronze-reinforced wooden cages. These weren't just prizes of war. They were the foundation stock for what would become Rome's most terrifying military innovation. The Romans, with their characteristic thoroughness, began what might be history's first systematic military breeding program. They established breeding facilities, or canilia, near major legionary camps across the empire. The facility at Vetera, along the Rhine frontier, became particularly renowned, housing over 300 breeding pairs and producing puppies that would grow into the stuff of barbarian nightmare. Roman military engineers, the same minds that built roads that lasted millennia and siege engines that could breach any wall, now applied their expertise to creating the perfect war dog. They studied bloodlines with the same attention they gave to metallurgy, tracked breeding records with the same precision they used for supply logistics, and developed training regimens that would transform puppies into disciplined instruments of warfare. The result was Canis Pugnax, a creature that combined the natural ferocity and size of British Mastiffs with Roman military discipline and tactical training. These weren't random attacks dogs, they were thinking weapons capable of following complex commands, operating in coordinated units, and adapting to changing battlefield conditions. Each Canis Pugnax wore a collar of bronze or iron, often decorated with spikes and bearing the legion's insignia. But this wasn't mere ornamentation. These collars served as both identification and protection. Archaeological evidence from sites across the former Roman Empire has revealed collars bearing inscriptions, like Canis Legionestes Fretensis, dog of the 10th Legion Fretensis, showing that these animals held official military rank and recognition. The breeding program's success was so remarkable that within a generation, Roman war dogs had not only matched their British predecessors, but had surpassed them. By the time of Emperor Augustus, Canis Pugnax had become an integral part of Roman military doctrine, with specific tactical manuals detailing their deployment, care and combat application. But transforming fierce British Mastiffs into disciplined Roman war machines required more than selective breeding. It demanded a training regimen so intensive and sophisticated that it rivaled the preparation of gladiators themselves. And it's to this brutal and brilliant system of canine military education that we now turn. The transformation of a Canis Pugnax puppy into a weapon of war began before the animal could even open its eye. In the breeding facilities scattered across Rome's vast empire, specially trained handlers called magistri canum, masters of dogs, oversaw every aspect of development, with the same scientific precision that Roman engineers applied to constructing aqueducts. From birth, these puppies were exposed to the sounds, smells and chaos of military life. The whelping chambers were deliberately placed near parade grounds, where newly born pups would grow accustomed to the clatter of armor, the blast of trumpets, and the shouted commands that would define their future existence. Roman military veterinarians, drawing from centuries of accumulated knowledge about animal husbandry, had discovered that early exposure to battlefield sounds prevented panic responses later in training. At 6 weeks old, when most dogs would still be playing, Canis Pugnax puppies began their military education. The initial training took place in specialized facilities that archaeologists have identified at major military sites across the empire. At Isca Augusta in Wales, excavations have revealed an elaborate complex of training yards, sleeping quarters, and even what appears to be an ancient veterinary hospital specifically designed for war dogs. The first lessons were deceptively simple, but they formed the foundation of everything that would follow. Puppies learned to respond instantly to whistle commands, hand signals, and Latin verbal orders. Impetus meant charge. Sta meant stop. Morsum meant bite and hold. These weren't suggestions. They were absolute commands that had to be obeyed regardless of fear, injury, or death. Roman dog trainers had observed that wolves in the wild operated with pack hierarchy and complex communication systems. They deliberately structured Canis Pugnax training to mirror and enhance these natural instincts. Each pack of war dogs was assigned to a specific handler, usually a battle-hardened centurion, who had demonstrated both courage in combat and skill in animal management. The relationship between handler and dog was more intimate than that between horse and rider, more crucial than that between legionary and centurion. These men literally lived with their charges, sharing food, sleeping quarters, and even battle scars. Ancient military records from the fortress at Deva show that dog handlers received double rations, not just for themselves, but to ensure their animals remained in peak physical condition. Physical conditioning began at 3 months. The training regimen would have impressed modern Olympic coaches. Young Canis Pugnax spent hours daily navigating obstacle courses that mimicked battlefield conditions, climbing wooden walls that represented enemy fortification, crawling under low barriers that simulated passing beneath enemy shields, and leaping over ditches that prepared them for the broken terrain of actual combat. Strength training involved pulling weighted sleds, loaded with stones, building the powerful hindquarters that would allow full-grown Canis Pugnax to leap over cavalry horses or drag down fleeing enemies. Endurance training consisted of forced marches alongside legionary patrols, often covering 20 miles in full armor. Yes, armor, for even in training, these dogs wore protective gear. The armor itself was a marvel of Roman engineering adapted for four-legged warriors. Archaeological finds from sites across the empire have revealed bronze chest plates, leather leg guards, and even spiked collars designed to protect vital areas while allowing full mobility. The most complete example, discovered at Vindolanda, near Hadrian's Wall, shows a sophisticated harness system that distributed weight evenly across the animal's frame, while providing protection equivalent to that worn by human auxiliaries. But physical preparation was only half the equation. The psychological conditioning of Canis Pugnax was perhaps even more intensive. These dogs had to learn to fight not with the wild fury of their ancestors, but with the disciplined precision of Roman soldiers. They had to distinguish between enemies and allies in the chaos of battle, maintain formation under cavalry charges, and respond to complex tactical commands even while engaged in mortal combat. Training scenarios became increasingly sophisticated as the dogs matured. Professional gladiators, often volunteers attracted by the generous pay, would don padded armor and engage in mock combat with adolescent Canis Pugnax. These weren't casual sparring sessions. They were brutal, realistic engagements designed to prepare both dog and handler for the lethal reality of warfare. The gladiators used blunted weapons and protective gear, but the dogs fought with genuine intent. They learned to target specific body parts, the shield arm to disable an opponent's defense, the legs to bring down mounted enemies, the throat for quick kills. More importantly, they learned to coordinate attacks, with multiple dogs working together to overwhelm larger opponents. Advanced training involved scenarios that tested not just individual skill but pack tactics. Groups of 6 to 8 Canis Pugnax would practice coordinated assaults on mock enemy formations. Some dogs would create diversions while others flanked the target. They learned to maintain spacing to avoid interfering with each other's attacks, to rotate out injured pack members, and to continue fighting even when their handler was down. Roman military engineers constructed elaborate training facilities that could simulate different battlefield conditions. Sand arenas replicated desert combat, muddy pits prepared the dogs for fighting in Germanic swamps, and elevated platforms taught them to fight on walls and fortifications. Each environment demanded different tactics, different timing, different coordination. Perhaps most remarkably, Canis Pugnax learned to integrate with human military formations. They could advance alongside infantry, maintaining perfect alignment with marching legionaries.
They could coordinate with cavalry charges, keeping pace with galloping horses while avoiding being trampled. They could even serve as living siege engines, specially trained dogs carrying incendiary devices or messages through enemy lines. The pinnacle of training came during joint exercises with entire legions. These war games, conducted annually at major military bases, featured thousands of soldiers and hundreds of war dogs engaging in mock battles that lasted for days. Ancient accounts describe these exercises as spectacles that drew observers from across the empire, with betting pools established on which units would perform best. By the time a Canis Pugnax completed its training, usually around 18 months of age, it represented an investment equal to equipping and training 5 human soldiers. These animals could follow over 50 distinct commands, coordinate complex pack maneuvers, and adapt to changing battlefield conditions with an intelligence that amazed even their Roman handlers. But training was only the beginning. The true test of these remarkable creatures came when they faced real enemies on actual battlefields, where their performance would determine not just their own survival but the fate of empires. And it's to those blood-soaked battlefields where Canis Pugnax earned their fearsome reputation that we now march. The year is in the shadow of the Carpathian Mountains as mist rises from the Danube River like the breath of sleeping giants. The greatest military machine in human history prepares for what will become one of Rome's most decisive campaigns. Emperor Trajan's legions, 80,000 strong, stretch across the Dacian frontier like a steel serpent coiled to strike. But among the familiar sounds of clanking armor and sharpening swords comes something else. The low, rumbling growls of over 2,000 Canis Pugnax preparing for their finest hour. Marcus Cornelius Fronto, a battle-scarred centurion of the 5th Macedonica Legion, runs his weathered hands along the bronze chest plate of his lead war dog, a massive beast named Ferox, whose scars tell the story of a dozen campaigns. In the flickering torchlight, the dog's eyes reflect an intelligence that seems almost human, the product of 18 months of training so intensive that it had transformed a creature of instinct into a thinking weapon. Today, old friend Fronto whispers in the mixture of Latin and Celtic that had become the unofficial language of dog handlers. We show these Dacian wolves what real predators look like. As Trajan's column advances into Dacian territory, the war dogs move with their human counterparts in perfect synchronization. Unlike the chaotic charge of barbarian warhounds, these Canis Pugnax maintain formation, their handlers using a complex system of whistles and hand signals developed over decades of warfare. They are not merely animals following their masters, they are professional soldiers who happen to walk on 4 legs. The Dacians, led by their warrior king Decebalus, had prepared for Roman cavalry and infantry. They had studied Roman siege tactics and developed countermeasures for Roman artillery, but nothing in their military tradition had prepared them for what was about to unfold. The first engagement came at dawn on the 3rd day of the campaign when a Dacian scouting force attempted to ambush a Roman supply column near the village of Tepe. The Dacians, confident in their knowledge of the local terrain, had positioned themselves in a wooded defile that would force the Romans into a narrow killing zone. What they hadn't anticipated was that Roman scouts included 4-legged members capable of detecting hidden enemies by scent alone. Ferox and his packmates had caught the Dacian scent 2 miles before the ambush site. Their handlers, trained to read the subtle body language of their charges, immediately recognized the alert postures and directed the column's commander to the threat. But rather than avoid the ambush, the Romans decided to turn the tables on their would-be attackers. While the main column continued its advance as if unaware of danger, 2 packs of Canis Pugnax, 16 dogs in total, were released to circle behind the Dacian position. These animals moved through the dense forest with a silence that would have impressed native hunters. Their training had taught them to coordinate not just with each other but with the broader tactical situation. They knew to wait for the signal to maintain position until the moment was perfect. The signal came as a blast from a Roman horn, not the typical advance call that Dacians might recognize, but a specific sequence that meant only one thing to the war dogs: impetus sine clementia, attack without mercy. What followed was a masterpiece of coordinated warfare that would be studied in Roman military academies for generations. As the main Roman force engaged the Dacians from the front, drawing their attention and forcing them to commit their reserves, the Canis Pugnax struck from behind with devastating effect. These weren't the wild attacks of ordinary dogs. Each animal had a specific role. Some targeted the hamstrings of standing warriors, bringing them down for human soldiers to finish. Others focused on disarming opponents by attacking sword arms. The largest dogs were trained to knock mounted enemies from their horse, neutralizing the Dacian cavalry advantage. Decimus Junius Brutus, a military tribune who witnessed the engagement, later wrote to his father in Rome, "The barbarians fought with the courage of lions and the desperation of cornered wolves, but our 4-legged legionaries fought with something more terrible, the calculated precision of Rome herself. I watched a single dog, no larger than a pony, coordinate with 2 others to bring down a Dacian chief whose bronze armor bore the dents of 20 previous battles. The chief never saw them coming, and by the time he realized the danger, it was far too late. The ambush at Tepe was obliterated in less than 20 minutes. Of the 400 Dacians who had positioned themselves for what they believed would be an easy victory, fewer than 50 escaped to carry word of this new Roman weapon back to Decebalus. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Word spread through Dacian territory of Roman demons that wore the shape of giant wolves but fought with the minds of men. But Tepe was merely the opening movement in a symphony of destruction that would echo across the ancient world. As Trajan's campaign progressed deeper into Dacian territory, the war dogs proved their worth again and again in increasingly complex and challenging scenarios. The siege of Sarmizegetusa, the Dacian capital, presented unique challenges that showcased the versatility of Canis Pugnax training. Urban warfare was different from open field combat. It required street-by-street fighting, room-by-room clearing, and the ability to distinguish between combatants and civilians in close quarters. Roman engineers had designed specialized equipment for urban warfare with dogs. Lightweight bronze armor allowed for greater mobility in narrow spaces, Special harnesses enabled war dogs to carry small incendiary devices or messages through areas too dangerous for human soldiers. Most innovative of all were the climbing harnesses that allowed specially trained dogs to scale walls and attack defenders from unexpected angles. During the assault on the capital's outer walls, a pack of 12 Canis Pugnax demonstrated tactical innovation that amazed even their Roman handlers. Faced with a wall too high for conventional scaling, the dogs spontaneously formed what modern military theorists would recognize as a living ladder. Larger dogs braced against the wall while smaller ones climbed onto their backs, creating a chain that allowed the topmost animals to reach the battlements. Once on the walls, these dogs didn't simply attack random defenders. Their training had taught them to identify and target commanders, men whose armor, position, and behavior marked them as leaders. By eliminating Dacian officers first, the dogs created confusion and disorder that allowed human Roman forces to exploit gaps in the defense. Lucius Nerva Traianus, the emperor's adopted son and future successor, witnessed this assault and later recorded his amazement. "I have seen men climb walls with grappling hooks and ladders, but today I watched dogs solve the same problem through pure intelligence and cooperation. They seemed to understand not just their individual roles, but the entire tactical situation. It was like watching wolves who had learned to think like generals." The fall of Sarmizegetusa marked the end of organized Dacian resistance, but it was far from the end of Canis Pugnax military service. As Rome's empire continued to expand, these four-legged warriors adapted to new enemies, new terrain, and new challenges with remarkable flexibility. In the eastern campaigns against Parthia, war dogs proved invaluable in desert warfare. Their ability to detect water sources saved countless Roman lives, while their stamina in extreme heat often exceeded that of horses. During the siege of Ctesiphon in 1100,
used to carry messages between besieging forces when Parthian cavalry made normal communication impossible. The desert campaigns also revealed another crucial capability. These dogs could track fleeing enemies across vast distances. Parthian tactics relied heavily on feigned retreats and ambushes, but it's difficult to set an ambush when your enemies can literally smell your presence from miles away. Roman pursuit forces guided by war dogs proved devastatingly effective at turning Parthian tactical withdrawals into genuine routes. Perhaps most remarkably, archaeological evidence suggests that some Canis Pugnax developed specialized skills based on their deployment locations. Dogs stationed along Hadrian's Wall became expert at detecting infiltrators trying to cross in darkness. Their handlers developed a complex system of silent signals that allowed them to communicate dog alerts without revealing Roman positions. In Germania, war dogs learned to fight in dense forests where visibility was limited and traditional formations broke down. They developed pack tactics specifically adapted to woodland warfare, using trees and undergrowth for cover while coordinating attacks through scent trails and subtle vocalizations. Along the Rhine frontier, Marcus Aurelius Severus commanded a mixed unit of auxiliary cavalry and war dogs that became legendary for their effectiveness against Germanic tribal raids. His tactical reports, preserved in the military archives at Mainz, described coordinated operations where mounted soldiers and war dogs worked together as a unified force. "The barbarians," Severus wrote, "expect our cavalry to charge direct. They do not expect our four-legged auxiliaries to circle wide and attack from the flanks while their attention is focused on our horsemen. By the time they realize they face enemies on both two legs and four, their formation is already broken." But perhaps the most famous engagement involving Canis Pugnax occurred not on some distant frontier but in the heart of Rome herself. During the civil wars that followed Commodus's assassination in 192 CE, the Praetorian Guard found themselves besieged in their own camp by the forces of Septimius Severus. The Praetorians, Rome's elite troops, were confident in their ability to withstand a conventional siege. Their camp was well fortified, well supplied, and defended by men who had spent their careers protecting emperors. What they hadn't considered was that Severus's forces included veteran war dogs from the Dacian campaigns, animals that had learned to treat fortifications not as obstacles but as puzzles to be solved. On the third night of the siege, a specially selected pack of 8 Canis Pugnax infiltrated the Praetorian camp through drainage tunnels that human soldiers could never have navigated. These dogs had been trained for exactly this type of mission, silent infiltration, target identification, and coordinated strikes against key personnel. The attack came just before dawn when human alertness was at its lowest. The war dogs didn't simply charge randomly into the camp. Their training had taught them to identify and eliminate sentries first, creating gaps in the defensive perimeter. Then they targeted officers recognizable by their distinctive armor and camp position. By the time the Praetorian Guard realized they were under attack, their command structure had been devastated. Senior centurions lay dead or wounded, sentries had been silently eliminated, and panic was spreading through the ranks. When Severus's human forces launched their assault minutes later, they faced not an organized defense but a confused mass of elite soldiers who no longer knew who was giving orders. The siege that military experts had predicted would last weeks ended in a single night. The Praetorian Guard, Rome's most prestigious military unit, had been defeated not by superior tactics or overwhelming numbers, but by 8 dogs who had learned to think like Roman generals. These victories established Canis Pugnax as more than just an auxiliary weapon. They were a fundamental component of Roman military doctrine. By the height of the empire, no major campaign was undertaken without them. No frontier fortress was considered complete without its pack of war dogs, and no general's reputation was secure without having commanded these 4-legged legionaries. But like all weapons of war, the Canis Pugnax would eventually face enemies they couldn't defeat and challenges they couldn't overcome. The very empire that had created them was beginning to change, and with it, the nature of warfare itself. On the blood-soaked fields of Adrianople, in what is now modern Turkey, the dying screams of horses mingle with human cries in a dozen languages, as the greatest military disaster in Roman history unfolds before the horrified eyes of Emperor Valens. But among the chaos of collapsing battle lines and fleeing soldiers, another sound has fallen ominously silent, the war cry of Canis Pugnax, Rome's 4-legged legionaries who had struck fear into barbarian hearts for over 3 centuries. The absence wasn't accidental. For the first time in generations, Roman legions had taken the field without their canine companions, and the results were catastrophic. 2/3 of the Eastern Roman army lay dead or dying, including the emperor himself, pierced by Gothic arrows as he fled the field. The military machine that had conquered the known world was crumbling, and with it, the war dogs that had been its most feared secret weapon. The decline of Canis Pugnax hadn't begun with a single battle or imperial decree, but with a gradual transformation of the Roman world itself. As the empire evolved from a pagan military state into a Christian civilization, the very foundations that had supported the war dog program began to erode. The change began subtly in the early 4th century, when Emperor Constantine embraced Christianity and fundamentally altered Roman military culture. Christian theology, with its emphasis on mercy and the sanctity of life, viewed the deliberate training of animals for warfare as increasingly problematic. Church fathers argued that turning God's creatures into instruments of death corrupted both the animals and their human handlers. Saint Ambrose of Milan, one of the most influential Christian leaders of the 4th century, wrote extensively against what he called the corruption of divine creation through military perversion. His treatise De Canibus Belli, on the dogs of war, became required reading in Christian circles and significantly influenced imperial policy. God created the dog to be man's companion, Ambrose argued, faithful in peace, gentle with children, loyal unto death. When we transform this noble creature into an instrument of slaughter, we commit sacrilege against divine order itself. The empire that rules through fear of beasts is no better than the barbarians we claim to civilize. The theological arguments gained political weight when influential Christian nobles began refusing military appointments that involved commanding war dogs. By 350 CE, many of Rome's most capable generals were declining frontier postings, specifically to avoid association with what they viewed as un-Christian warfare. But religion was only part of the story. The nature of warfare itself was changing in ways that made traditional Canis Pugnax tactics less effective. The barbarian tribes pressing against Rome's borders had spent generations studying Roman methods and developing countermeasures. Germanic chieftains had learned that war dogs, despite their training, remained animals with predictable instinct. They developed tactics specifically designed to exploit these weaknesses, using female dogs in heat to distract attacking war dogs, employing specialized weapons like weighted nets to entangle charging animals, and training their own warriors in anti-dog combat techniques. Perhaps more significantly, the barbarians had begun adopting Roman military organization while maintaining their traditional flexibility. Gothic cavalry, Frankish infantry, and Vandal raiders combined Roman discipline with barbarian adaptability, creating military forces that could match Roman tactical sophistication while exceeding Roman mobility. Against these evolved enemies, the rigid formations and predictable tactics of Canis Pugnax became liabilities rather than advantages. War dogs trained to attack traditional barbarian warriors found themselves facing enemies who knew exactly how they would behave and had prepared accordingly. The economic pressures of the later empire also contributed to the decline. Maintaining war dogs had always been expensive. The breeding programs, specialized training facilities, professional handlers, and veterinary support required enormous resources. As Roman finances became increasingly strained by barbarian raids, civil wars, and economic instability, military budgets were forced to prioritize immediate necessities over long-term investment. The breeding facilities that had once produced hundreds of war dogs annually were converted to more mundane purposes or simply abandoned. The last recorded shipment of British Mastiff breeding stock to the continent occurred in 367 CE, effectively ending the genetic renewal that had kept Canis Pugnax lines strong for centuries. Archaeological evidence from former breeding sites tells the story of gradual decline rather than sudden collapse. At Vetera, the great canine training facility that had once housed over 300 breeding pairs, excavations reveal a pattern of downsizing that stretched across decades. Storage areas were converted to other uses, training grounds were given over to conventional military purposes, and the specialized equipment for dog warfare was melted down for more conventional weapons. The handlers themselves, the magistri canum, who had represented generations of accumulated knowledge about war dog training and deployment, found their skills increasingly irrelevant. Many transitioned to civilian roles as hunting guides or livestock guardians. Others joined barbarian tribes as mercenaries, ironically using their expertise to help Rome's enemies develop counter-tactics against the war dogs they had once commanded. Marcus Flavius Vegetius, writing his influential military manual De Re Militari in the late 4th century, devoted only a single paragraph to war dogs, a stark contrast to earlier treatises that had dedicated entire chapters to their deployment. Even more tellingly, Vegetius treated canine warfare as a historical curiosity rather than contemporary military doctrine. The ancients, he wrote with the detached tone of someone describing obsolete technology, employed dogs of exceptional size and ferocity in their wars, training them as they would human soldiers and deploying them with considerable effect against barbarian enemies. Such methods, while ingenious in their time, have proven unsuited to modern conditions and Christian principles. The final blow came not from any single cause but from the convergence of multiple pressures during the crisis-ridden 5th century. As barbarian kingdoms established themselves within former Roman territories, they brought with them different military traditions that had no place for war dogs. The Visigoths,